Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Friends of the show, Kyle Anzalone and Will Porter, join me for a special 3-part series on the rise and fall of John Brennan, done in a roundtable format and released in 3 separate episodes in the coming week for our listeners or available in advance and full for our patrons. Kyle Anzalone is the host of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast and the editor-in-chief of Immersion News. He also writes the daily news roundup at the Libertarian Institute. Will Porter is a freelance journalist with a focus on U.S. foreign policy and conflicts abroad. His work can be found at Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, and Consortium News. In American political life, few officials have weathered as many storms as the former CIA director John Brennan. With a career marred by virtually endless series of scandals, Brennan's ability to maneuver himself within institutions of power has served him exceptionally well, both inside and outside the government. Brennan's decades-long tenure at the CIA presents a microcosmic portrait of U.S. foreign policy since the fall of the Soviet Union, a true exemplar of the American role in a unipolar world. His name has become synonymous with torture, regime change, targeted assassinations, drones, spying, the arming of foreign militias, and now, in the era of Trump, politicized intelligence. But that may have finally come to an end. Revelations about his role in Russiagate and the recent revocation of Brennan's security clearance could represent the final nail in a coffin that until now has simply refused to stay shut. Join us in this 3-part series, reviewing Brennan's career at the CIA, the litany of scandals tied to his name, as well as what could come next for the retired spy master. This discussion was recorded in 2 sessions on August 24th and 31st of 2018. And this is part 3.
John Brennan, the men and women of the CIA will have the leadership of one of our nation's most skilled and respected intelligence professionals.
It is indeed a tremendous honor to be nominated to be the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The women and men of the CIA are among the most dedicated, courageous, selfless, and hardworking individuals who have ever served this country. At great personal risk and sacrifice, most times their successes will never be known outside the hallowed halls of Langley and the Oval Office. If we had the opportunity to take bin Laden alive, if he didn't present any threat, the individuals involved were able and prepared to do that. The concern was that bin Laden would oppose any type of capture operation. Indeed, he did. It was a firefight. He was engaged in a firefight. Here is bin Laden, who has been calling for these attacks, living in this $1 million plus compound, hiding behind women who were put in front of him as a shield. We didn't contact the Pakistanis until after all of our people, all of our aircraft were out of Pakistani airspace.
We had confidence that we had control, that IED was not a threat. It was not an active threat at that time.
Back in 2012, when we were discussing, we discovered the underwear bomber, John Brennan at that time briefed ex-CIA agents who were retired. He briefed them and said, oh, don't worry, the U.S. has someone inside. We have inside control. Well, then one of these ex-CIA agents went on television and said, oh, yeah, we have a double agent and nobody needs to worry. And it's like, whoops, the double agent was still there. John Brennan leaked information that almost cost the life of a double agent.
This was a very serious leak, and a very, very serious leak. I've been a prosecutor since 1976, and I have to say that this is among, if not the most serious, it is within the top 2 or 3 I've ever seen. It put the American people at risk, and that is not hyperbole. It put the American people at risk.
The allegations of, CIA hacking into, Senate computers, nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, we wouldn't do that.
But the CIA's own Inspector General determined the agency did spy on Senate investigators. 5 agency employees improperly accessed committee files and reviewed some of the emails of committee staff members.
President Obama, and with John Brennan himself, has been sitting down deciding who gets killed.
We're exceptionally precise and surgical if there are terrorists who are within an area where there are women and children or others. We do not take such action that might put those innocent men, women, and children in danger. In fact, I can say that the types of operations that the U.S. has been involved in, that nearly for the past year, there hasn't been a single collateral death because of the exceptional proficiency, precision.
He keeps saying that there are so few civilian casualties. It's just a lie.
A focused effort at people who are on a list of active terrorists who are trying to go in and harm Americans.
In the 6 strikes we examined, of the 82 people killed, 2/3 were civilians.
I think the American people will be quite pleased to know that we've been very disciplined, very judicious, and we only use these authorities and these capabilities as a last resort. My wife, Kathy, who, like the spouses of many other public servants and intelligence professionals, has made numerous sacrifices over the years. Similarly, I would like to pay tribute to my 3 children, have had to deal with the disappointments associated with an absentee parent.
I speak for the mothers.
All right. We will stop again.
In Yemen,
all right.
Pakistan, Somalia.
Please remove that woman.
And the Obama administration, they won't even tell Congress what countries we are killing children.
Please.
We, the U.S. government, and we CIA are very, very clear in terms of the types of behaviors and actions that we will not tolerate. If that type of suppression and abuse of human rights.
Detainees who were subjected to EITs at some point during their confinement subsequently provided information that our experts found to be useful and valuable. And the cause and effect relationship between the application of those EITs and the ultimate provision of the information is unknown and unknowable. But for someone to say that there was no intelligence of value that came from those detainees once they were subjected to EITs, I think that lacks any foundation at all.
We did some things that were wrong. We did a whole lot of things that were right, but we tortured some folks.
In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, our nation ached, it cried, and it prayed. In a limited number of cases, agency officers used interrogation techniques that had not been authorized, were abhorrent, and rightly should be repudiated by all. And we fell short when it came to holding some officers accountable for their mistakes. I did not take steps to stop the CIA's use of those techniques. I was not in the chain of command of that program. I served as deputy executive director at the time. I was aware of the program. I was CC'd on some of those documents, but I had no oversight of it. I wasn't involved in its creation.
You support the appointment or the nomination of Gina Haspel to head the CIA. Why?
She will speak truth to power.
Critics think she didn't do that around the questions of enhanced interrogation.
Well, yeah, it was a much different time. I think many of us, if we look back on that time, we wish we would have done some things differently. I wish I would have yelled a little bit more, but it was at a time when the embers of the World Trade Center were still burning. Mm-hmm. I think Gina is somebody who's going to protect the institution from being exploited and used by Donald Trump. Gina is the best hope to keep the CIA independent, quite frankly, so that you're going to have somebody there who knows the intelligence business and will not try to just give Donald Trump and senior policymakers what they want.
Mr. Putin's decisions to move into Ukraine, his decision to move into Syria with military forces was based on the premise that there was not going to be a symmetric Western military response. I remember being on the schoolyards of New Jersey when I grew up, and bullies and try to intimidate, and they keep moving forward unless they get their nose bloodied a little bit. And I felt as though Mr. Putin really needed to get his nose bloodied.
A summit meeting between the President of the United States, the most powerful person in the world, and Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, who is a bloody and murderous despot. Unfortunately, I think he has been masterful in how he has manipulated perceptions and how he's manipulated and quite frankly, duped Mr. Trump.
The Free Syrian Army, the moderate opposition. They're fighting against Assad, who rained down chemical weapons on their families. That deserves support, deserves protection from the United States. And I do not believe that you're going to see any stable and secure future in Syria unless Assad passes the scene. There's no way that Assad, the butcher of Damascus, should stay in power.
Make no mistake about it, the American justice system, I think, is going to prevail in this endeavor to get to the bottom of who might have been collaborating and working with foreign actors to try to undermine the integrity of the election. CIA, during the course of 2016, worked very closely with our domestic partners, and if there were opportunities to work with foreign partners to try to understand what Russia was doing, not what U.S. persons or U.S. Officials were doing.
Have you talked to anybody in the press since leaving?
No, I have not. You're the first one that I've talked to in the press.
Meaning on, off the record, or any of that?
That's correct, yes.
Director Brennan, do you know who commissioned the Steele dossier?
I don't.
Do you know if the Bureau ever relied on the Steele dossier as part of any court filings, applications, petitions, pleadings?
I have no awareness.
Did the CIA rely on it?
No.
When I use the term, this is nothing short of treasonous, I equate it to the betrayal of one's nation, basically aiding and abetting, giving comfort to an enemy.
Yes, I will speak out. I'm hoping to be able to shake quite frankly, some sense into the people around Mr. Trump. He certainly has the authority to do it, to basically order the Department of Justice and the FBI to release this information, even that which was redacted earlier.
It's an order from the White House. Should they be obeying it? Should they be protesting?
Well, I think Christopher Wray, Director of FBI, and Dan Coates, Director of National Intelligence, as well as Rod Rosenstein, who is overseeing this investigation, should push back against any directive that is going to have negative impact on our capabilities, as well as the investigation. So I think they should continue to push. If Mr. Trump and the White House does not relent, well, then I think they have some decisions to make, whether or not they're going to just not follow that direction and be fired, or to resign. They have an obligation, since they took an oath of office, to the Constitution of the United States, not to Mr. Trump.
I think there's a big question, first of all, in terms of those who are on Mr. Trump's national security team, whether they can continue to serve in good conscience an individual who basically betrayed his nation. And those who are going to be silent in this administration are complicit. He is giving aid and comfort to the enemy, and it needs to stop. And Mr. Trump needs to understand that there are going to be consequences for him, too.
Maybe this is a good time to get into the Rachel Maddow article or interview and just bring up the fact that in spite of the fact that John Brennan had once spied on Dianne Feinstein trying to produce a torture report, he is now the glory boy of, kind of the mainstream liberal media. It's astounding that, those two things could both be true, that he could have spied on Dianne Feinstein while she was trying to release the torture report, and he is now their favorite person and anti-Trump, analyst.
Yeah, it is a good time to transition over. And you still have to also wonder why Obama kept putting up with this. Because it's just, the longer this war goes on in Syria, the worse we look, the more the curtain gets pulled back. And it has just really a disastrous impact on Obama's legacy itself. Yeah, this is a good time to transition over to the fall of John Brennan. I would argue that it's already happening with this war in Syria. I've got a bunch of clips. I think that basically this interview is so telling in itself that we can kind of just go through these clips and discuss them. So we're back to the point where John Brennan's clearance has been yanked. He's been battling with Trump for, I would argue, since before the election, but more publicly after the election. Maybe, let's say, since the intelligence assessment comes out in January. I think it was December of 2016. And on August 17th, he does a major interview with Rachel Maddow. In my view, the purpose of this interview was to, well, first of all, it was to give Brennan the stage to give his side of the story. But it very much looks to me like it's to give Brennan an opportunity to try to clean up some of the mess that he's created for himself. but it's clearly it's for public consumption. But I think it's also to influence others in the intelligence agencies, current and former, and members of Congress. So here's the first clip.
How has it been these past couple of days since the president singled you out for attack and punishment in this way?
It's fine. As far as I'm concerned personally, I'm fine. It's not unexpected. He had signals that something like this was going to happen. Nobody, though, got in touch with me from the White House or CIA since it was first noted that my security clearance was under review. I learned about it when somebody called me to say that Sarah Huckabee Sanders was announcing at the podium that those clearances were revoked. Again, I was not shocked for a couple reasons. One, there was a heads up. But secondly, I'm not shocked, quite frankly, at all the appalling things that Mr. Trump has done. And so I think this is an egregious act that flies in the face of traditional practice, as well as common sense, as well as national security. I think that's why there's been such a outcry from many intelligence professionals, not to support me, but to support the principle that security clearances are something that's very, very solemn and sacred, and they never, ever should be used for political purposes.
All right, so did you guys see this in person? Did you catch the body language and all that?
Yeah, I watched it a couple times.
So, do you believe what he's saying there? It's fine, I'm fine, or?
No, it's funny, like, hearing the clip earlier about him talking about the Senate, spying on the Senate or hacking into their computer systems or whatever, you can really hear a lot of the same kind of, like, vocal intonations. So, like, you can tell when John Brennan is trying to be Mr. Reassuring or Mr. Honest, Mr. Integrity. And that's exactly, I think, what he's adopting right here in this interview is, like, trying to be, oh, I'm fine, this isn't about me. This is just about, my fine principles and all this kind of stuff. And I don't buy it, of course.
Yeah, and he says he's not doing it for himself. He's doing it for the others around him. And he's getting some pretty serious pressure at this point. He's getting support. There's pushback from others in current and former intelligence, members of the intelligence agencies. And it expanded from there to the State Department and some other parts of the national security state. But there are also some people saying that this man's done a lot of. It's pretty clear now that there are real consequences. It's not just a battle of words.
I mean, I think it's worth pointing out for the way Maddow frames the whole thing. How do you feel about being attacked? I mean, the guy wasn't beat up on the street or told that he couldn't speak to the press anymore. He had a, privileged security clearance revoked. So, too bad that you lost your privilege on that, buddy. And then, he has to evoke, like, we have this, like, historical CIA lasting privilege that we get to keep our security clearance. And he can't even make a real argument for him to keep it, obviously, because everything he's ever done has been disastrous. And so certainly he shouldn't have any influence over policy. Look at what his last ones have done and how poor his decision-making has been. But, that's why he has to go to, like, this mythical, like, this is CIA tradition. I get to keep my power and authority and, all my privilege. And that's just not the case. Like, too bad. I think it's, like, in a way, I wish I could just enjoy this guy who, after all the terrible things he has done, has finally, like, started to lose some of his power. And yeah, I can't, because I know there's a lot of people who actually feel bad for him when he's sitting there going, oh, poor me.
Yeah. I mean, they're elevated to like a godlike status, and it's just pretty stunning to see.
Right. And he tries to deflect too that it's about him. He's like, it's not about me. It's about the institution. And you could tell it really bothers him and he really wants his security clearance back. But he's just, trying to say, oh, I'm the martyr. I don't care if my security clearance gets revoked, but the Nets guy, that's the, bunch of crap.
Yeah. And then she sets him up and asks if he's going to retaliate. They actually there's actually two parts where they talk about this. I can't remember if I added them together here, but here's when they talk about a lawsuit.
are executive orders that supposedly guide the way these things are handled. Congressman Cummings has suggested overtly that it may be illegal, what the president has done. Congressman Schiff, who's the top Democrat on Intel, has suggested the same thing. Are you considering legal action, or do you think you have a legal right to exert against the president's actions here?
Well, I think, as you can imagine, a number of lawyers have reached out to say that there is a very strong case here, not so much to reclaim mine, but to prevent this from happening in the future. Mm-hmm. And so I am thinking about what it is that I might want to do. At this time, I'm trying to make sure that the principle is what is going to be defended and supported. And this is something that should not be repeated. The other people on the so-called enemies list now, I think this is just another example of Mr. Trump trying to frighten and intimidate others. But I can tell you, having worked in the national security and intelligence community for many, many years, these are not the type of people who are going to be bullied or intimidated by someone of the likes of Mr. Trump.
I just want to point out that this part was in the very beginning of the interview, but then at the very end of the interview, they return to it and they allow him to, I don't know if you want to call it reinforcing what he said or clarify what he said. So this part here was actually at the very end.
Director Brennan, I just want to underscore one point that you made in our initial segment, which is that you said you are considering the possibility of legal action in terms of your security clearance revocation.
It would be with the eye toward preventing this type of abuse by Donald Trump in the future, not to reclaim mine. Although this is the first time in 38 years I haven't had a security clearance, I am very concerned about the future generation, the current generation of intelligence officers. It was a privilege every day of my life to be a part of this community that kept this country, this wonderful country, strong and safe. And I don't want to ever allow a politician or someone in the Oval Office to just so cavalierly toss around national security and security clearances. So I will fight on behalf of those who still have their clearances.
Director Brennan, I have disagreed with you publicly and privately on a number of serious policy issues.
I look forward to talking about those issues in the future.
I look forward to talking about this too, but I want to tell you, for all my disagreements with you on a number of different policy matters, I have profound and earnest respect for your service. So thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Rachel.
Director John Brennan of the CIA, 25 years CIA officer and 4 years as CIA director, stripped this week of his security clearance by the president. Something unprecedented happens almost every day. You would think that would be a blessing in the news business. Sometimes it feels like a curse.
My God, that was just sickening. I wonder why they did that again. Was it to reinforce the threat, or was he not happy with the way he said it the first time, or what? But yeah, so now he's throwing out threats because he doesn't have a clearance anymore. I would imagine. I feel like this is a man who's losing power, but he wants to still keep fighting. He's never gonna give up.
Yeah, it certainly seems like he's grasping at it. I mean, a question would be, why would a guy who's out of government service even want a security clearance? And I think part of the answer is that he can kind of peddle it. Like, he can peddle just merely by having a security clearance, he can peddle the perception that he's a guy who's in the know. And indeed, I'm pretty sure he's employed now by MSNBC. And I think that was before he got his clearance revoked. But and so, yeah, that helps to land gigs for these kind of people. It helps to solidify their prestige and their legacy and their place in, their voice in politics. It helps to secure that.
Yeah, their mystique too is every time you see them speak, you're like, oh, he can, and he has played this game sort of like he can infer things, he can sort of say things, and even if he just doesn't completely imply that he knows something that's secret and you should just believe him because he has access to the super secret information, it's always in the back of your mind whenever you see any kind of a major intelligence official, you're figuring, well, he knows things that I don't know. And frankly, in Russiagate, I think they've relied on that a lot. When they weren't able to make a real argument or present evidence, it just became sort of this trust me thing. That's been going on for almost 2 years now.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. And it's always that, when they make these assertions and then they're able to get some very circumstantial and often, coincidental proof that, Ivanka Trump happened to be in the elevator once with somebody who was a Russian, or, the Trump Tower meeting. There's always these little small things they try to tie together, but, they're missing anything to tie it all together. And so when John Brennan says, I believe that Russia conspired with Trump to have the election. And, then they say, okay, well, and then he lays out all of his evidence and they say, well, but what's the real evidence? The fact that John Brennan says, well, I believe it's true, makes people think, well, that guy knows more than I do. So obviously whatever's missing, it's an implied part of having that security clearance.
Exactly. So then Rachel Maddow, actually, this is where you can sort of tell that Brennan has, that this time it's different. It's different than before. And that Brennan really has crossed the line. And now he's not only caused trouble for himself, but now it's a threat. Because all this time you got to remember that Trump's saying, yeah, I pulled John Brennan's clearance. And he has a list of other people who he thinks he publicly states that maybe that he's looking into pulling theirs too. And Rand Paul was out there, that earlier clip we played, saying, I think we should change the whole policy. Everybody should lose their clearance when they, leave the government service. So there's clearly a panic because a security clearance is worth a lot of money in this town. And some people can't do their jobs without it. Contracting is a major thing now. There's so much outsourced. 70% of the U.S. intelligence budget is spent on private contracting. So you can imagine the kind of panic that is going on right now. And there's one more thing that I don't recall who explained this or brought this up, but it made a lot of sense to me. They said that the other problem that this will cause for John Brennan is that, he'll need to rely, if he wants to get inside information, there are going to be people on the inside who are going to talk to him. And even though that's technically illegal to leak anything, it's going to be less of a risk if he still has a security clearance. Now, the people on the inside, if they talk to John Brennan about classified information, it's a much more serious situation, and they might be less inclined to talk to him. So he could be really out in the cold.
Yeah, well, I would definitely think so, especially with, Trump's or with Brennan's feud with Trump. The fact that, if John Brennan's on TV and says something that, people know is classified, well, then they're going to know that somebody illegally gave John Brennan information there and go looking for that person. And
That's
so,
true too.
This isn't like giving information to somebody at like a petroleum company or something about like security, information in Libya or something tactical like that. This would be giving information to John Brennan that he goes and says on MSNBC, because that's what John Brennan's doing with the information. You can't have that happen because it's going to come right back to you because everybody knows about it.
Yeah, and the Obama administration was known for cracking down on whistleblowers. But the Trump administration, since he was elected, it was just the most over-the-top pouring out of leaks that I've ever seen in my life. And so this administration is looking out for the leakers. So that makes it even more. But anyway, I think this clip sort of demonstrates that there's a lot of pressure on Brennan right now, because look what Maddow does.
Presidents over the centuries, over the generations, some of them have been terrible jerks, if you read the right history books. Some of them have been deliberately divisive. Some of them have had terrible ideas or treated people in their personal lives or even in political life in egregious ways. Your criticism of President Trump rises above that type. Despite what you just articulated here, you've gone further than that. After Helsinki, you were stark and even a little bit scary in your criticism of his behavior. You said it rose to treason.
I said it was nothing short of treasonous.
In this current controversy, that specific comment has been singled out by a number of people as a comment that maybe by you crossed the line. That was maybe
Cross what line?
Well, was
it freedom of speech?
No, I'm not saying you don't have a right to say it, but do you stand by that consideration? And can you explain, can you elaborate what you mean by treasonous? It's a very serious allegation.
I know what the Russians did in interfering in the election. I'm at 100% confidence in what they did. And for Mr. Trump to stand on that stage in Helsinki with all the world's eyes upon him and to basically said he doesn't understand why would the Russians interfere in the election. He's given Mr. Putin and the Russians a pass time after time after time. And he keeps referring to this whole investigation as a witch hunt, as, bogus, as, and to me, this was an attack against the foundational principle of our great republic, which is the right of all Americans to choose their elected leaders. And for Mr. Trump to so cavalierly just dismiss that, yes, sometimes my Irish comes out, and in my tweets, and I did say that it rises to and exceeds the level of high crimes and misdemeanors and is nothing short of treasonous, because he had the opportunity there to be able to say to the world that this is something that happened. It should never, ever happen again. And if Russia tries at all to do it, they're going to pay serious price for it. I don't expect Mr. Putin to acknowledge it. He's going to deny. But for the President of the United States to continue to prevaricate on this issue, I think does a great injustice and a disservice to the men and women of the intelligence law enforcement community, and does a great disservice to the citizens of the United States. And that's why I said it was nothing short of treasonous. I didn't mean that he committed treason, but it was a term that I used, nothing short of treasonous.
Well, you didn't mean that he committed treason, though.
I said it's nothing short of treasonous. That was the term that I used, yeah.
That's that. If we diagram the sentence, nothing short of treasonous means it's treason. I mean, the reason I'm bringing this out is because when you say, I know what the Russians did, and when knowing what the Russians did, observing the president's behavior, you go to the word treason, it suggests that you think the president may be serving a foreign country rather than our own.
Well, yeah. I think he has crossed the line repeatedly in terms of his failure to fulfill the responsibility of the office and to look Vladimir Putin square in the eye and say, this should never, ever happen again.
Do you think that he is knowingly serving the interests of the Russian government instead of the U.S. government?
I scratch my head a lot. I'm puzzled over why Mr. Trump acts this way with such obsequiousness to Mr. Putin. I don't know. And I'm not going to try to pretend that I know. But there is something that is very disconcerting, very worrisome about how an individual who occupies the Oval Office interacts with Mr. Putin. And I'm a great advocate of improving relations between Moscow and Washington. Don't get me wrong. I was a strong supporter of that during the Obama administration. And I stuck my neck out a number of times, particularly on Syria, to say, no, we need to be able to work with the Russians to be able to bring this mass carnage to a halt. But time after time, the Russians, would feign sincerity better than anybody I've ever known. But I do believe we need to get this behind us. I don't want this to, roil the waters forever. But we need to have a president who's going to acknowledge this and make sure that he is able to then move on.
How do we get this behind us? I mean, you're suggesting that there's things that we do not yet know that have not yet been adjudicated or laid fairly before the American people about the president and his connection to what happened with Russia. Do we need to know that in order to move on, or should we decide to move on before we know?
It's called the Mueller investigation. It's called the duly appointed special counsel who was given the mandate to investigate what Russia did in terms of interference in our presidential election, and who might have been working in support of Russian objectives, and who might have committed a crime in that process. And so that's why Robert Mueller is a real national treasure. He needs to be able to continue with this investigation unimpeded.
So at first I thought Maddow was trying to help him walk it back. But then when he did walk it back, she's like, well, no, you said treason. And then he kind of doubles down. I mean, I don't even understand what was going on there.
Yeah, it sounded to me like Maddow was trying to draw him out into something real hawkish and stuff. And then he kind of in the middle of it was like, oh, wait a minute. Although I guess she did challenge him on the I think she expected him to elaborate and say, yes, it was treason. But here he stepped back and said, no, I didn't mean treason. And she was like, what the hell, buddy? You're screwing up our narrative here. And then he kind of goes into under Obama, I helped to, improve relations with the Russians. And at that moment in the conversation, Maddow just kind of looks deflated. She's like, oh man, let's not talk about getting along with the Russians, like she tries to then push it into another direction there.
She's got a lot on the line. She's just spent the last, 1.5 years. I'd say I think people may have calculated this, but at least half of her time, maybe more like 80% of her time has been dedicated to Russiagate, right?
Yeah, and it makes some sense to me, too, why Brennan would appear on her show. Like, it seems to me that he feels a little out in the cold right now, and he wants to really make sure he solidifies his position with the resistance or whatever. And what better way to do that than appearing on Maddow? She's like one of the, leaders of the resistance, I think, anyway. It seems like on TV.
It was a shocker, that's for sure. Oh, it wasn't really treason. I mean, I don't know. He sort of backs down, and then he gets right back into his narrative again. And he also, in the process, he said, I know that the Russians, I forget the exact quote, but I know what the Russians did, I have 100% confidence, he says. All right, so that was the clip that really made the news, because here he wouldn't back down on the treason claim. He, in fact, doubled down before, and now he said, I wasn't really accusing him of treason. And it was just my Irish. Just my Irish came out. All right, so the next clip has to do with the Mueller indictments of the Russian military intelligence, the GRU.
Mueller's indictment about the GRU, about Russian military intelligence, lays out in black and white, in great detail, an alleged criminal conspiracy to illegally sway the U.S. election. It's named conspirators. It describes what they did. There was an agreement among multiple actors to pursue an aim, and then they took actions in pursuit of that aim. So they've defined a criminal conspiracy existing in the world.
On the part of a foreign government, which you need.
Yes.
Foreign government, yes, absolutely.
But because that conspiracy has been defined, what would an American have to do to be considered part of that conspiracy? Right? If you've got a foreign conspiracy orchestrated by a foreign government, what does it mean to have an American abettor? What does it mean for an American? I mean, the word collusion has become, refrigerator poetry. Yes, and these days it's used by anybody for any reason, right. And oftentimes incoherently. But what would amount, in your minds, in intelligence terms, to an American being a part of that conspiracy, the one that's been defined by Robert Mueller already?
Yeah, and I will leave it to the lawyers and to courts to decide whether or not something is criminal or not. But in my mind, it requires someone to knowingly support the efforts of a foreign government to interfere in U.S. domestic politics, and especially in election. And so any American who was working with the Russians or working with intermediaries who were working with the Russians, and those Americans who knowingly tried to collude, conspire, and to work with them in order to advance their political objectives here in the States, I think that rises to the level of conspiracy. Now, a lot depends on what Robert Mueller has been able to uncover. Maybe there's none of that. And in my op-ed in the New York Times, when I said that Mr. Trump's claims of no collusion are hogwash, is because there is collusion, I think, in open sight now, because of so many things I've learned since I left office, because of what has appeared in the press. The Trump Tower meeting with Don Jr. and others. And I also, when I was CIA director, I didn't know that it was the day that Mr. Trump basically gave a public call to the Russians to find Hillary Clinton's emails, that in fact it was that same day that the GRU was actively looking for it. So there is collusion in plain sight, but I don't know whether or not any of that rises to the level of conspiracy, and whether any of that conspiracy rises to the level of criminal liability for that conspiracy.
You described in detail before Congress an open setting congressional testimony last spring that in the summer of 2016, you at CIA were alarmed by, you said your radar went up about the number of contacts between Russian officials and U.S. persons at a time that Russia was mounting this interference campaign. When you say that your radar went up about that, did your radar go up about that just because it appeared that Russian operation had as a component of that operation the engagement of Americans toward that end? Or was it specifically because of the people, the Americans, the specific U.S. citizens who those Russians were targeting? What was it that put your alarm up?
Well, first, I knew that it was a very intense Russian effort to interfere in the election, number one. Number two, I am well aware and have a lot of experience in observing what the Russians will do to try to suborn American citizens, to get American citizens to work for them. And this was a very intensive effort. And so, as I said in my op-ed,
myself and Jim Comey and Mike Rogers from NSA, we talked about the importance of making sure that our radar, our collection radar, was up so that we had early indications or be able to uncover any effort on the part of the Russians to work with American citizens. But the American citizens were reaching out to the Russians as well to see what they could get, see if they could get any dirt on Hillary Clinton. So my radar was going because I knew the Russians were engaged in this effort, and I was aware of contacts with American citizens that may have been totally innocent on the American citizens' part, and maybe they weren't abetting at all.
Was it clear to you that those contacts with American citizens were part of the operation, that it was part of the way that Russia was trying to accomplish its objectives?
I was very concerned and aware that the Russians were trying to leverage U.S. citizens in order to achieve their objectives in the presidential election.
While you were in office as CIA director before you left on Inauguration Day, did you conclude that U.S. persons were successfully leveraged in that effort?
No. And that's why I said in open testimony that I was concerned about these contacts because people will go down a treasonous path, sometimes very unknowingly, and they get into very hot water and deep water, and then they, in fact, cannot extricate themselves because the Russians are very clever at getting people in positions of potential compromising positions that they then cannot sort of turn back. So when I left office on January 20th of 2017, I had unresolved questions in my mind about whether or not any of those U.S. persons were working in support of the Russian efforts.
And those were referred, those concerns about specific U.S. persons referred to the FBI.
Right. We call it incidental collection in terms of CIA's foreign intelligence collection authorities. Anytime we would incidentally collect information on a U.S. person, we would hand that over to the FBI because they have the legal authorities to do it. We would not pursue that type of investigative, sort of leads. We would give it to the FBI. So we were picking things up that was of great relevance to the FBI, but we want to make sure that they were there so they could piece it together with whatever they were collecting domestically here. Again,
so it was an intelligence sharing operation between
Right. We put together a fusion center at CIA that brought NSA and FBI officers together with CIA to make sure that those proverbial dots would be connected.
So I think all that kind of speaks for itself. And then the last part that I thought was relevant was we're talking about the dossier leak to the press. The various times that people have said that the Trump investigation, that election wasn't fair because information about the investigation against Hillary was leaked, was public, was given to the public, not leaked. James Comey talked about it publicly. But the Trump investigation was hidden, and that gave him an unfair advantage. It wasn't really true because the story came out, I think in September 2016 and in October. And there have been claims that John Brennan was behind that leak, the Steele dossier. Brennan claims he never even saw the Steele dossier at this point. And Maddow helps him lay out his story here.
Several weeks before the election in 2016, the early fall of 2016, I know personally that two well-respected reporters here at NBC approached you and asked you about a story that they were chasing concerning then candidate Donald Trump and connections he might have to Russia and the Kremlin. You were approached by these reporters. They were asking for either on the record or off the record guidance from you on that story, and they say you told them, I don't think I can help you with that. I don't think I can help you with this. I can't confirm it. I don't have that for you. I can't help you. So you wouldn't confirm any of it. You offered no help. This was September of 2016. It sounds like at that time you actually did know quite a lot about the Russian operation to influence the election and potential connections to the Trump campaign. The press was coming to you with these queries. I know they at least were coming to you from these queries from within this building. What was that of interest to you that the press seemed to be onto some of this? And how did you handle that press interest?
Yes, well, I don't think I've ever been asked this question on a news show. But in fact, I informed the Senate Intelligence Committee about this in my closed testimony over the past year and a half. Yes, it was in September. And two journalists, noteworthy members of the media, asked me if I had heard about a document or a report about that contained some salacious information related to Donald Trump.
Were they specifically asking about the alleged sex tape? Or
they were talking about that, and they used some of those descriptors. Didn't go into great detail, but they led me to believe that it was related to some things that might have happened in Moscow. I didn't confirm or deny anything for various reasons. One is that I don't talk to American journalists about U.S. persons, ever. Number two, much less talk about a U.S. presidential candidate to journalists. And it was later that year when, in December, was the first time I had ever put eyes on the so-called Steele dossier, that I recalled the conversation I had with those two members of the media and said, oh, this must be what they're talking about, because they said this was widely circulating among the media and the press, this document, this report, these rumors, or whatever else. And I basically told them, I can't help you with that, and I'm not going to engage. But it was subsequent to that that I connected the dots then and said they must have been talking about what ultimately was referred to as the Steele dossier. Again, I didn't see that dossier until December. There are a lot of people out there, including members of Congress, who claim that I told Senate Minority Leader at the time, Harry Reid, about it in August or September. That is false. I did not have eyes or information on that dossier until after the election. That's right.
Before it was published in January, but after the election in November.
Right. It became a hot topic of debate within CIA, NSA, and FBI and DNI about whether or not to take that dossier into account when the intelligence community assessment was done. We decided no, because there's no way we could substantiate it. It wasn't an intelligence document. So it was appended to it, but it was not taken into account at all as that intelligence community assessment was done and was completed.
The President has made a specific, on-the-record allegation against you on that specific topic.
So...
Yeah, can we point out real quick that John Brennan's narrative includes him, the CIA director, the director of NSA, and I think he also said the FBI director, but some intelligence bigwig were looking out for possible collusion between Russian agents and U.S. political figures. And then there was a document that was widely circulated among the U.S. media about that, that would prove these allegations. And John Brennan says that he didn't see it as director of the CIA. I mean, come on. You're saying that the document is widely circulated among the media and the CIA director who is looking for this information. I mean, again, this is either a case where he's lying or he's incompetent.
Or it's a technicality that there are multiple versions of the Steele dossier. The Steele dossier is a conglomeration of a number of different memos. You might be able to technically say he didn't see whatever. Has anybody even defined what the Steele dossier is? It's like made up of, I don't know, dozens of different memos. But yeah, I don't find that. I don't know if you really find anyone other than Rachel Maddow who will believe that story, that he never saw that dossier until whatever he said, December 2016.
Right. I mean, a lot of this is just really like self-serving stuff that we can't really prove. It's really just take his word or not. However, there's one thing that he claims there about Harry Reid, that like Harry Reid, I believe, wrote a letter on the basis of whoever told him about the Steele dossier. He wrote a letter, I think, to Comey about it. So he got that information from somewhere. So it either came from Brennan or somebody else. So Brennan denies it, but who else could have done that?
Yeah, it seems like Maddow's trying to help him clear his name of that. But actually, I don't want to get into all the rabbit hole of Russiagate for this episode. But one of my biggest questions about Russiagate is why Brennan was doing that. He pushed Reid twice to write a letter to Comey, urging that Comey open up an investigation, an FBI investigation. And why was he so desperate to do that? I don't have an answer. I have some theories, but that's for another time. But yeah, why was he pushing so hard on that?
Yeah, it certainly suggests that he had some deeper involvement in this Russiagate thing, somewhere near the core of it.
Yeah, definitely the core of it. And I guess there's one more thing, and this is where I think it's very clear what Brennan is doing here, and I've seen him do it before. You know, he's still trying to get Trump pushed out of office. This is like the third different, I guess impeachment is the last. Somebody's brought up another method too, like annulment, which I never even heard of before, but he's pushing on the Republicans, Brennan, here.
So again, how desperate is he going to get? And do the Republicans really want to have to clean up after a disaster? Or do they want to stop this before it becomes disastrous? It's their choice. And if things become disastrous, it's going to be on their shoulders, on their conscience.
It sounds to me like he's worried that the Republicans aren't going to turn on him. He needs for the Republicans to. The big dilemma here is that they don't have control of Congress to, his allies, the Democrats, the resistance, if you will. They don't have any power to impeach him, and that's why, of course, 2018 midterm election, such a big deal. But that seems to me that's Brennan's way out, is to get Trump out of office. It's sort of like a cage match at this point. And right. Rachel, he needs to use the media to pressure the Republicans. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I was going to just say, maybe that's kind of why, like you say, this might be kind of his fault. He might be kind of scrambling here because he realizes that, wow, I really need to, put some pressure or try to influence these Republicans who, as far as I know, Brennan has less influence among Republicans than among Democrats. Maybe you guys can address that further, but maybe that's part of the reason why he's kind of freaking out now. Like, oh man, he's sort of burned through all of his powerful allies. That's why I think he's sort of turning to the media partially. It's part of it here.
Yeah, I mean, he wrote this op-ed. Admiral McRaven, the sort of icon from the Special Operations Forces, wrote an article saying, Mr. President, take my clearance away too, and he praises Brennan. And there's quite an uproar after Brennan lost his clearance. But almost all the people who wrote letters and objecting to Trump's pulling his clearance, there's a caveat, a disclaimer inside those statements saying, not all of us necessarily agree with John Brennan, what he has said or the way he said it. So they put that disclaimer in there, and they say that, like, we're making this clear that we just don't believe that people should be punished for political speech. That's really as far as they were able to go. The media, many in the media, tied it, really characterized it as a defense of Brennan, but I think it was really just not necessarily a defense of Brennan. It was just a warning that, you better not go after, this is a precedent they didn't want set. And I suspect that there are a lot of people who are really not happy with Brennan right now. And you can sort of sense that in this interview. You can sense that he's emotional. He's upset about this. Here's what Trump said on the day that he pulled the clearance.
I don't know McRaven. I know that I've gotten tremendous response from having done that because security clearances are very important to me. Very, very important. And I've had a tremendous response for having done that. There's no silence. If anything, I'm giving him a bigger voice. Many people don't even know who he is, and now he has a bigger voice, and that's okay with me because I like taking on voices like that. I've never respected him. I've never had a lot of respect. And Senator Burr said it best. If you knew anything, why didn't you report it when you were before all of these committees, including their committee? So he had a chance to report. He never did. This was just came up lately, and it's a disgusting thing, frankly. Look, I say it again. That whole situation is a rigged witch hunt. It's a totally rigged deal. They should be looking at the other side.
He tries to knock down Brennan's freedom of speech argument by saying, I'm not suppressing his speech. If anything, I'm giving him a bigger voice. But I don't think that's the point that Brennan was trying to make. I think Brennan was trying to say, if I speak out, I'll be punished for it. But
Yeah,
another reaction
that might have just been a little bit of a window into the way Trump kind of looks at these issues and how his view of the media is, how he understands that, like, even if something bad happens to you and it gets you on TV a whole bunch, that's not necessarily a bad thing. At least that's, kind of Trump's interpretation of it. And I think that just looking at Trump politically, that's probably the case. And I think it's just kind of a good insight into that.
It's interesting, too. He makes it really clear that Brennan's voice is the kind of voice that he wants to publicly battle with. But I thought there was two. Well, first of all, did Comey say anything about this? I didn't really hear anything from him. Mike Rogers, he's gone silent as far as I know. Clapper and Brennan have been together in the press on this, and they've been sort of a united front for a long time. But for the first time now, we have Clapper. I've seen it characterized as Clapper throwing Brennan under the bus, and I find it kind of hard to argue with that. Here's Clapper on CNN.
Do you think that John Brennan's hyperbole is an issue here? Is one of the reasons we're having this crisis?
Well, I think it is. I think, John is sort of like a freight train, and he's going to say what's on his mind. I think, though, that the common denominator among all of us that have been speaking up, though, is genuine concern about the jeopardy or threats to our institutions and values. And although we may express that in different ways, and I think that's what this really is about. But John and his rhetoric have become, I think, an issue in and of itself.
That's the first time I heard Clapper. They've been strong defenders of each other up till now.
Yeah, it certainly seemed like this is sort of a break in the relationship where he's not backing single thing he says. And he does try to sort of backtrack for him and explain, like he's I forget exactly what he says, something about his Irish, something about his, he's got a temper on him or he's a freight train is what he says. So, he's trying to kind of help to make it seem reasonable what he said, but he's not backing it.
Yeah, and he used the term has become. So, yeah, I think it's a sign that, this could be the turning point. That's why I think that this is possibly Brennan's fall. And then there's one more guy who's very savvy in the press, and this is the former CIA director, Michael Hayden. He's a little bit more nuanced, but he kind of says the same thing.
I don't have to explain myself on that one.
Right.
I don't go there.
You don't go there.
I really do try to keep it to the facts of the case. And, just in questions of style, I don't refer to the fellow down the street with anything other than the president. I never just use his last name without the title. And I do think that the office and the occupant, the current occupant of the office, deserves the respect that is due any American president. But you bring up a tremendous challenge. All right? This is the most norm-busting president in the history of the United States. There are no norms that seem to bind him, none that he is not willing to cross or break for his personal, policy, or political needs of the moment. And that offends, I think it's what frightens people like me. In pushing back against that, fair enough, I think that's a service. We are always tempted to break our own norms in pushing back against the most norm-busting president and so on and so forth. And so we have got to be very, very, very careful, because if we break our own norms in protesting the president's violation of norms, we're not making things better.
We're not putting the guardrails back on.
We're adding to the damage.
I mean, I think he's saying something similar. Clapper says that Brennan has become a problem, and I think Hayden is saying the same thing. He's adding to the damage.
Right.
By breaking the norm. Sorry.
This seems to, like, as you're saying, does seem to be a case where the rest of the establishment is really breaking with John Brennan. And hopefully this will be the death blow that his career needs. I mean, we've gone through, just hours now of crimes that have surrounded John Brennan. It's the policies that he's advocated for is the reason why, on 9/11, there were only a few hundred Al-Qaeda terrorists. And now there's tens of thousands. And dozens of countries. It's the policies that this guy has advocated for. And so while I think it's pretty stupid that tweet is going to be what ends up burying John Brennan, or at least I hope it is, it's not, the fact that he spied on the torture report committee, or that he armed the jihadist rebels in Syria. But hell, if he goes away, better for all of us, because the scariest thing in my mind would be a John Brennan Secretary of Defense. I mean, I've heard Tom Cotton floated by Trump, and that would be terrible and scary. But John Brennan, I can't even imagine.
And it's not, I agree that the tweet was sort of the triggering event. It is pretty outrageous, right? But it also, assuming that he is at the middle of Russiagate, and that he did have this obsession with taking down Trump first, in the beginning, is not even letting him take office, but after that, making sure that he either was forced to resign or was impeached, or whatever method they choose. And the Mueller investigation has been, a pretty big embarrassment. And this story that he wove, he wasn't the only one who wove it, but he was certainly in the forefront, is what it shows is a giant. And let's just also add in that it's pretty clear that they were spying on the Trump campaign, right? Whatever words you want to use, whether they were justified or not, whether they had reason to believe that there was contact with the Russians or whatever. I haven't seen the evidence of that yet. But, I don't count out that maybe something happened. But overall, what is very clear and what has sort of slowly unfolded in front of our eyes is just a massive abuse of power. I think that the abuse of power is the thing that ultimately takes down John Brennan.
I was just going to say, my last word on that last clip there, if this is, the end of Brennan, if this is his downfall, I think what we would have to see is exactly what you sort of suggested. His allies sort of abandoning him, his people in intelligence, his people in politics abandoning him. Because nobody in this system gets as far as Brennan has without allies. Nobody does that by themselves. We just saw, Michael Cohen and Manafort basically get thrown under the political bus. And those are men who just ran out of political allies. Men with political allies don't get consequences like that. And Brennan, thus far, throughout his long, scandal-ridden career, has managed to avoid any real consequences. However, now we might actually finally be seeing his allies dry up, and this might actually be his demise.
There's just one last point I want to make, is that in the past, when Brennan has gotten into really big trouble, I'm sure he's used his allies, as you're saying. He certainly used his biggest ally, which was President Obama. But the other thing he would do is he would use his allies in the media. And generally what they would do is a big magazine profile would be printed on the topic. For example, in May of 2012, Joe Becker and Scott Shane did a big New York Times article called Secret Kill List Tests Obama's Principles. And some of the language in it was just stunning, really. Like, here's a quote. Beside the president at every step in his counterterrorism advisor, John O. Brennan, who is variously compared by colleagues to a dogged police detective tracking terrorists from his cave-like office in the White House basement, or a priest whose blessing has become indispensable to Mr. Obama, echoing the president's attempt to apply the quote-unquote just war theories of Christian philosophers to a brutal modern conflict. And then there's just a couple more short clips. Quote, the nominations go to the White House. We're talking about the kill list now. The nominations go to the White House, where by his own insistence and guided by Mr. Brennan, Mr. Obama must approve any name. He signs off on every strike in Yemen and Somalia, and also on the more complex and risky strikes in Pakistan. About a third of the total. And then it says, aides say Mr. Obama has several reasons for becoming so immersed in lethal counterterrorism operations. A student of writings on war by Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, he believes that he should take moral responsibility for such actions, and he knows that bad strikes can tarnish America's image and derail diplomacy. And there's one more. Harold H. Coe, for instance, as dean of Yale Law School, was a leading liberal critic of the Bush administration counterterrorism policies. But since becoming the State Department's top lawyer, Mr. Coe said he has found in Brennan a principled ally. Then he says, if John Brennan is the last guy in the room with the president, I'm comfortable, because Brennan is a person of genuine moral rectitude. Mr. Coe said, it's as though you had a priest with extremely strong moral values who was suddenly charged with leading a war. I mean, how over the top is that? And this constant, referral back to priest-like and back to the religious thing. There have been a number of these profiles, but there was another one at the end of June. This one is in the New York Times Magazine, June 27th, 2018. And this one's called A Spy Master Steps Out of the Shadows. And, I mean, it's the same kind of thing. And in this case, they even go into more detail about him going home to his North Jersey town and being in a bar with his brother and his buddy from childhood and just all these ridiculous things about him. And, in the past, those things have helped to save him. So I guess, we'll have to see I think the Maddow interview was maybe the beginning of his attempt to, although I didn't hear her talking about any of the religious or moral things, I guess we'll just have to see what step he takes next and if he's got people willing to stand up for him this time. But I get the sense that they are going to throw him under the bus because he's done real damage now, ironically, to their power and their wealth, their access to jobs and the trough of the giant defense budget and everything else. So I guess it remains to be seen. I don't know. It's just, like I said before, I don't think Brennan is responsible for all of these things solely as an individual. This is a massive war machine we have. This is a massive government and a massive empire. But, it's still stunning the amount of power that this one man has and what he's done with it. Anyway, guys.
Yeah, sure. All I can really say is I'm optimistic for maybe his demise.
Anything you want to say to wrap it up or add to it? Is open the floor.
I mean, I feel like I pretty much covered most of everything I've had to say. Like I kind of said before, was just like, hopefully this is them, because man, and as you said, it's not all his fault, but he's had his fingers in a lot of these different terrible things that have happened over the years and have only served to, make Americans less safe, kill a lot more people overseas. And while, he may get these flowery profiles of him where they claim him to be a moral man, basically what he, I guess, would be doing is just distorting the reality to justify his murder. And, it's kind of disgusting that played so well with Barack Obama, too, that, John Brennan was apparently able to say, oh, it looks like, maybe we'll kill one person, but we'll take out these 5 really bad guys and they're going to kill 25 more people. So, this is really the right thing to do. The fact that he's able to sell, that kind of bullshit is just absolutely terrible.
I think it would be kind of unprecedented. I don't, off the top of my head, I can't think of another high-level official in the intelligence agencies that's ever really been held accountable. It'll be interesting. And I guess the other last point I want to make is that earlier on I said, that there's sort of some parallels between the rise and fall of the, let's call it decline. It's not exactly, I don't think we're going to just fall and crash, though who knows. But I see some parallels between, John Brennan's career sort of rose and declined during the same years that the American Empire did. And at this point in time, I think one of our existential crises is that, we can't be the superpower forever. The full spectrum dominance and all that is not a sustainable, in my view, and many experts' views too. It's not a sustainable goal. And there seems to be, an existential struggle going on right now between the people who want to scale back, who want to sort of turn inward. Let's fix things in our own house, and just that things have gotten out of control, and that the best thing we can do for everybody, certainly in this country and really in the world, is to pull back and right the ship, if you will. And I think John Brennan sort of has that same, and sort of the whole national security state has that same decision to make. And Brennan himself, is he going to keep doubling down on this, like some of the war party here in the United States wants to do? Or is he going to sort of admit failure? And I think maybe he could survive this if he would just sort of chill. And that remains to be seen. This administration, I think, and particularly the president, at this point, there's been so much damage, and I don't know he ever really lets this go, but I don't know. We'll see. All right, guys. So thank you so much for spending all this time on the rise and fall of John Brennan, and please tell the audience where they can find your work.
Yeah, Joanne, thanks so much for having me on the show and letting me talk so much to your audience, and hopefully you all got a lot out of it. My podcast is foreign policy focused, so the best place to find my podcast is the Libertarian Institute, and that's at libertarianinstitute.org. And then I also publish a daily news roundup on that site. And it's usually 10 to 15 news stories, on kind of world events of the day. So if you want to stay up to that, check that out. And I also have my news site, immersionnews.com. So check that all out, guys. And again, Joanne, thanks so much for having me on.
And yeah, you can find me. I'm Will Porter. I'm a freelance journalist. I write for consortiumnews.com, the libertarianinstitute.org, antiwar.com. I'm a regular guest on Kyle's show, Foreign Policy Focus, so you can hear me on there often. And if you really enjoy what I do and want to support my work, you can find me at patreon.com/WKPjournalist.
All right. So thanks again. I really appreciate it. And let's come up with another topic, do another roundtable at some point. Love having you guys on. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Joanne.
A few weeks have passed since we recorded this series, and as is now the norm for this clattering train, the axles creak and the couplings strain, a few recent developments are worth mentioning. Immediately after Brennan's security clearance was revoked in mid-August, as demonstrated in the Maddow interview, he was in a damage control mode because he'd done some serious harm to the reputation, the cover, and the power of the so-called deep state. Brennan was rattled because even though many former officials came forward to protest the revocation of his security clearances, almost all of them disclaimed support for Brennan himself, his words and his actions. But it didn't take long for him to recharge his bombast. A week later, he made a heroic, standing ovation-worthy appearance on Bill Maher's show.
A true American patriot, John Brennan. I've been having a hell of a time here on this show trying to get my guests to say the word treason. I think the president is guilty of that.
There are two principal reasons why I use that term. One is that I think I exhausted all the other adjectives in the English language to describe Donald Trump's failure to fulfill his responsibilities as President of the United States, number one. Number two, but when I saw him on that stage in Helsinki, failing to be able to say to the world and to Vladimir Putin, Russia tried to interfere in our election. It never should have happened. It never should happen again. And if it does, Russia's going to pay some very severe consequences as a result. But he didn't do that. And so treasonous is defined as a betrayal of trust as well as aiding and abetting the enemy. And so that was the word that came to my mind.
The McCain funeral was a week-long grandiose eulogy for the man and the superpower he so loved. It was also delivered, as meticulously planned by McCain himself, a bipartisan resistance barrage against the uninvited current president he so loathed. Several days later, juicy bits from a forthcoming Woodward book titled Fear were publicized. The New York Times, for example, provided takeaways about, quote, relentless infighting, unquote, and, quote, toxic and volatile, unquote, work culture, where officials work around the president who's, quote, unstable and uninformed, unquote, and who suffers from constant anxiety about Mueller's Russia investigation. During that same week, the New York Times published an anonymous op-ed, allegedly written by a currently serving senior official, titled, quote, I am part of the resistance inside the Trump administration, unquote. The author declared that the president is not aware that, quote, many of the officials in his own administration are working diligently from within to frustrate parts of his agenda and his worst inclinations. They have vowed to preserve our democratic institutions until he is out of office or, quote, it's over, unquote. And in the meantime, they are the remedy for his, quote, erratic behavior, unquote. The author then declares that they are not the deep state, they are the steady state. As an aside, about a week later, John O'Connor, who calls himself, quote, the lawyer who revealed Mark Felt as Watergate's deep throat, unquote, wrote his own op-eds speculating that the New York Times anonymous op-ed is connected to Woodward's book, the Mueller investigation, and the Russian collusion investigation. He claims that Brennan is, quote, the godfather of the dishonest Russian collusion investigation, unquote. O'Connor refers metaphorically to a series of tidal waves, each coming together to form a tsunami which could ultimately swallow the president. Interestingly, at the same time, yet another wave of Watergate revival activism was sweeping through the media too. As they say, you can't make this stuff up. Or maybe you can. John Brennan tied these events together too in his commentary on NBC's highly rated morning show, The Today Show, in an impressive demonstration of his concern trolling capabilities.
I have no idea who wrote it. Well, I think there are two major takeaways. One is what the author wrote is wholly consistent with all the reports that we have seen over the last year, the reports within Bob Woodward's book, and other things about just how unfit, reckless, irresponsible Donald Trump is. But secondly, it shows the depth of concern within the administration, within the senior ranks of the administration about what is happening, and the extraordinary steps that individuals are willing to take, such as this op-ed, to prevent disasters. And it's active insubordination. It is, but it's insubordination born out of loyalty to the country, not to Donald Trump. This is not sustainable, to have an executive branch where individuals are not following the orders of the chief executive. But I see all the warning signs of looming disaster, as does this person. Well, I think it's going to have an impact in terms of a cumulative effect that we've seen over the past week. The memorial service for John McCain and very eloquent statements about the American values that are not being followed by Donald Trump. Secondly, the Bob Woodward book and all the exposés there. And now this. And so I think you see just a continual sort of increase in the concern, the extraordinary measures that people are taking. I do think things will get worse before they get better. I don't know how Donald Trump is going to react to this. A wounded lion is a very dangerous animal.
And then came the freak out over Trump's order to declassify documents. At the moment, Brennan is fighting the release of documents related to the Russiagate scandal from his perch on a variety of cable news shows. On a seemingly daily basis, he uses his media pulpit to call on Republicans in Congress and committee members to stop President Trump. Sometimes he's on several times a day. He advised top officials at the FBI, the DOJ, and the DNI to defy a presidential order to declassify and release a batch of documents. They're excerpts from a FISA surveillance warrant on Carter Page, multiple FBI reports related to that Carter Page FISA warrant, FBI interviews with DOJ official Bruce Orr, and unredacted text messages related to the Trump-Russia investigation from former FBI Director James Comey, former Deputy FBI Director Andrew McCabe, DOJ official Bruce Orr, former FBI agent Peter Strzok, and former FBI lawyer Lisa Page. Republican congressmen had hinted about the documents, which they have seen, and Devin Nunes said that Democrats and the media are likely to be quote-unquote frightened by them, and Trey Gowdy issued a specific rebuttal to John Brennan.
Now to the topic of the declassification. Here's the former CIA director on this order by the president to declassify these documents and texts.
I think they should continue to push. If Mr. Trump and the White House does not relent, well, then I think they have some decisions to make, whether or not they're going to just not follow that direction and be fired, or to resign. They have an obligation, since they took an oath of office to the Constitution of the United States, not to Mr. Trump, to uphold their responsibilities.
So he's essentially saying to intelligence officials, don't do it.
I've read every document that is under consideration. Brett, I don't think the release of this information is going to change anyone's mind. It's certainly not going to change John Brennan's mind, because remember, he wanted Donald Trump put on the dustbin of history. He's accused him of treasonous conduct. John Brennan is as responsible for the American public being divided on this issue as anyone I can possibly think of. So I honestly, no disrespect intended to him, could really give a damn less what John Brennan thinks the president or the intelligence agency should do. He's part of the reason that we are in this historic conundrum. I've read it. Other than one document related to George Papadopoulos, I don't think people are going to be that interested in it. And I don't think any minds are going to be changed. I think the bias of Peter Strzok has resulted in us having a hung jury, frankly, no matter what comes out. I've read it. Some of it's embarrassing for the Department of Justice. Some of it's embarrassing for the FBI. Embarrassment is not a reason to classify something. So a lot of it should be embarrassing to John Brennan. And maybe therein lies why he is so adamant that this information not be released. I've read it. I don't think it's going to change anyone's mind. But I've seen nothing in it that is going to jeopardize the national security interests of this country.
Last thing, we last talked, you said you hadn't seen any evidence of Russian collusion at all. Still true today?
Yeah, Brett, the only thing is Adam Schiff in March of 2017 saying he had evidence that was more than circumstantial but not direct. And, oh, by the way, there is no such thing. But if you can lay aside Adam Schiff, the wannabe senator from California, no one has presented any evidence, and the best way for that to be proven is release all the transcripts of all the witness interviews we did during 2017 down at House Intel. All of them. Jared Kushner, Donald Trump Jr., Susan Rice, Samantha Power. Release all of them, because I ask every witness, give me all the evidence you have of collusion, coordination, conspiracy, regardless of whether or not you even believed it. Every bit of evidence you have. No one had anything. So there is no evidence of collusion, which is why the Democrats have pivoted to obstruction of justice.
In a matter of days, Trump reneged on his declassification threat and turned the task over to a snail-like DOJ Inspector General. So the efforts by Brennan and others, including 2 foreign governments, to suppress the information have been successful. For now, anyway. As we speak, there's probably yet another bombshell scandal hot off the presses or the internets. It's relentless, and I think it wouldn't be hard to make the case that it has had a noticeable negative effect on the psyche of masses of people. In some of his early speeches as CIA director, John Brennan vowed to be more visible to the public than his predecessors, who largely stayed in the shadows, issuing glomar responses to inquiries. It turns out that Brennan kept his promise to stay under the public spotlight. But as for his definition of transparency, well, that's another story. More often than not, Brennan confuses the light of transparency with the media limelight. The Wurlitzer plays on, constant chaos, booms on social media, announce so-called bombshell stories, declarations of constitutional crises, days, nights, weekends, holidays, continuous since the 2016 wretched election, the outcome of which the powerful and the fearful still seem determined to change. The powerful and fearful patriots of moral rectitude professing to stand for the highest values and goals, for whom nothing is too sacred to exploit except themselves and their own interests. But as Mr. Brennan often tells us, things that are happening today are unprecedented, abnormal, and cannot stand. Maybe that will include accountability for those who abuse their awesome power, yet fly above the law, fail upward, and are too big to jail. And that's part 3, the last episode of this 3-part series. Thank you for listening. A special thanks to Kyle Anzalone and Will Porter. Follow Kyle Anzalone on Twitter at KYAAALE, Kyle. Subscribe to his podcast, Foreign Policy Focus, and find his work at immersionnews.com, libertarianinstitute.org, and also support him at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Follow Will Porter on Twitter at WKPANCAP. Find his work at Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, and Consortium News, and support him on patreon.com/WKPjournalist. The Around the Empire podcast is independent media, brought to you with the help of our generous donors. You can pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or do a one-time donation on our website, aroundtheempire.com. Follow us on Twitter at Around the Empire. It helps a lot if you hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel. That's free, because then it's possible to get revenue for the channel via live streams with a super chat donations capability after we get 1,000 subscribers, and we're not there yet. Also, use the thumbs up icon to like the individual videos. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Apple Podcast, or on your preferred radio podcast app. Note that we're now on Spotify and iHeartRadio, and we were just added to Google Play Music as well, so you can find us there. If you like the podcast, take a minute to leave a nice review. It really helps. And lastly, please like our page on Facebook. And we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.